He called us not the right kind of people, then destroyed my son's career. I sat quietly, said nothing. He never thought to ask whose signature he needed. My name is Grant Rockwell. I am 67 years old. I live alone in a wood frame house on a hillside outside Asheville, behind a row of old oaks that block the road from view in summer and go thin and skeletal in winter, when you can see the ridge line from the kitchen window if the sky cooperates. I have lived there for 22 years. My neighbors know me as the retired engineer who shows up when something needs fixing and doesn't linger afterward, the man with the old truck and the clean yard. I have never corrected that impression. People draw their own conclusions when you give them nothing to work with. I have always preferred it that way. I want to be precise about something before I go further, because it matters to everything that follows. The story I am about to tell is not about revenge. I have turned that word over in my mind many times in the months since it happened, and I keep arriving at the same place. What I did was not revenge. Revenge implies heat, and there was no heat in any of it. What I did was simply allow the truth to finish traveling to its destination. I had been patient for 31 years. Patience that long is not passive. It is a form of certainty. A certainty that the distance between what a man builds and what a man performs will eventually close on its own, without anyone's help, if you simply stay out of the way and let the architecture do what architecture does. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is a habit I have had to discipline in myself over the years. The instinct to begin at the end. My father had it too. That tendency to arrive at the conclusion before the evidence was fully assembled. He was a good man, my father, but he was impatient with the middle of things. I think about him more often than I used to. That is something that happens, I find, as you get older. The dead take up more space, not less. I should tell you about my son first. Landon is 39 years old. He has his mother's jaw and my habit of going quiet when something is wrong, which has caused problems for him in the same ways it caused problems for me, and probably caused problems for my father before that. He has been married to Yasmin for 11 years. They have a son, Theo, who is 7, and who has, as far as I can tell, inherited none of the family tendency toward silence, and all of the tendency toward asking questions at high volume from close range. He is one of the best things in my life. Both of them are. Landon came to architecture the way most people come to the things that turn out to matter, not because anyone pointed him there, but because he kept wandering in that direction regardless of the other options available. He spent 2 years in a business program, found it tolerable but airless, and transferred into an architecture school at 21 without telling me in advance. He called on a Tuesday evening after he had already submitted the paperwork. He said he thought I might argue. I told him I would have argued before, not after. He said he knew that. We understood each other in that moment, in the way that fathers and sons sometimes do, suddenly and without ceremony, the way a door opens that you did not know had been closed. He graduated, worked his way through a small regional firm for 2 years, and was hired by Callaway Whitfield and Associates at 28. They were mid-tier then, growing fast, with a reputation for winning projects that required a particular kind of technical precision, combined with what I can only describe as an ability to make clients feel understood. Landon was good at the second part in a way that cannot be taught. He listened in meetings the way some people listen to music, not waiting for his turn to respond, but actually absorbing what was being said, setting it in context, folding it into whatever he was already holding. Clients noticed. Partners noticed. Inside of 4 years, he was running relationships on accounts worth 8 figures. He gave that firm 6 years of his life. 6 years is not an abstraction when you are 39. 6 years at that stage is nearly a fifth of your entire adult existence. It is the difference between building something and having built something. He had built something. His name was on proposals that won. He had a team that trusted him and a client list that asked for him by name. He was not simply employed there. He was, in the plainest possible sense of the word, established. I want you to hold that word, established. Because the word that came to replace it, when everything unraveled, was its opposite. And the distance between those two words, the space where 6 years of work used to be, is what this story is actually about. I first met Gerald Ashford at a dinner in the spring, about 3 years before everything happened. Landon and Yasmin had invited both families for the first time. It was a warm evening in May, the kind where you open all the windows and the air moves through the house in a way that feels deliberate and kind, and conversation comes easier than it usually does. Yasmin's mother was a quiet and careful woman with very good posture and a habit of smiling with her eyes slightly before her mouth caught up. I liked her immediately and without reservation. Gerald was a different experience. He was not rude. I want to be careful about that. Rudeness would have been easier to read and easier to dismiss. What Gerald was fluent. He moved through a conversation the way a skilled contractor moves through a renovation, always aware of the load-bearing walls, always calculating what can be removed without the structure noticing. He asked about my work in the first 20 minutes. I told him I did technical consulting. He nodded in the way a man nods when he has already categorized what he is hearing and moved on to the next piece of information. He asked whether business was good. I said it was steady. He said that was the important thing, steady. And then he pivoted to something else, leaving that word, steady, sitting in the air between us like a coin he had dropped and decided not to pick up. I did not react to it. I noted it, filed it, and kept eating. Over the following years, I sat across from Gerald Ashford at 8 or 9 dinners. I watched him work a room. I watched him manage manage his daughter the way some people manage subordinates, warmly, attentively, but always from a position of assumed authority. I watched him look at Landon. That is the right word. Look, not see. Gerald watched Landon the way an appraiser watches a property he has already decided is undervalued. There was no malice in it exactly. It was more architectural than that. Gerald Ashford simply did not believe, at any point over those 3 years of dinners and holidays and family occasions, that my son was the correct load-bearing structure for the life he had designed for his daughter. He never said this to me directly. Men who operate the way Gerald operates do not say things directly if they can avoid it. What they do instead is apply pressure at the load-bearing points and wait for the structure to shift. I noticed the pressure long before Landon did. This is not a criticism of my son. It is simply a function of having been in the world longer and having spent more time watching men like Gerald work. The canceled contracts were the first thing. Landon called me on a Tuesday in October about 2 years before everything collapsed and told me that a second client had withdrawn without documentation, citing a preference change. He said it in the tone of a man who has already decided the most reasonable explanation is the correct one, and the most reasonable explanation was the market. I asked him one question, whether he had any sense of whether anyone had made calls to the client before the decision. He said he didn't think so. I told him to keep an eye on it. I did not tell him what I was already thinking, because I had nothing beyond a pattern and a feeling, and patterns and feelings are not the same as evidence. I drove home from that call thinking about Gerald, not with anger, with attention. There is a difference. Anger narrows the field. Attention opens it. I drove home and made dinner and sat at my desk afterward, and I thought carefully about what I knew and what I did not know, and I decided to keep watching. The pressure continued over the following months in ways that were individually deniable and collectively unmistakable. A reference that did not come through. A professional introduction that was mentioned and then never materialized. A client dinner at which Landon's name was quietly absent from the guest list in a way that could have been oversight and probably wasn't. None of these were provable. All of them were consistent. I kept a mental record. I did not share it with Landon. He was working too hard and sleeping too little, and there is a moment in every difficult situation where adding information makes things worse rather than better. I had not yet arrived at the moment where the information would help. The direct intervention came in early spring, about 8 months before the end. I know this not because I witnessed it, but because Yasmin told me about it months later, after it was over, sitting at my kitchen table with her coat still on. Gerald had gone to her while Landon was traveling for work. He had sat down across from his daughter at the kitchen table where his grandson ate breakfast every morning, and he had laid out his position with the same precision he applied to everything. He said the marriage was pulling her in the wrong direction. He said Landon did not have the foundation that would sustain the life she deserved and the life Theo deserved. He said my family, the Rockwells, were not the right kind of people for where she was going. He said all of this quietly and without cruelty, which in some ways made it worse, because cruelty is a form of desperation, and desperation can be addressed. But calm certainty delivered in a warm kitchen by a man who loves you is a different kind of weight entirely. He told her that if she remained in the marriage, he would reclaim the assets held in her name and withdraw the financial support he had extended over the years. The apartment they had lived in before buying the house had been purchased with his assistance, a portion of Theo's school fees, a line of credit that had been there during a lean year. He had been careful about those things. Gerald had. He had made sure his generosity had architecture, made sure there were load-bearing elements that could be removed, not the right kind of people. I have thought about those words many times. I have tried to approach them the way I approach any structural problem, by asking what they are actually holding up, what function they serve, what the person deploying them believes about themselves and about the world that makes those particular words feel like truth rather than preference. The answer I keep arriving at is simple enough, even if the path to it is not. Gerald Ashford had once lost nearly everything. Earlier in his life, before his daughter was old enough to understand what was happening around her, a financial collapse had taken apart what he had built and left him starting from a position he had never anticipated occupying. The man who came out the other side of that was shaped by it in ways he had probably stopped examining long before I met him. The need to control the perimeter of his world, to ensure that every element within it had been vetted and sanctioned and positioned, that need did not come from strength. It came from a fear so old and so well integrated that he had long since mistaken it for judgment. I am not saying this to excuse him. I want to be clear about that. Understanding the architecture of a harmful act is not the same as absolution for it. The calls he made cost my son his position at a firm he had built 6 years of his professional identity inside. The words he said to his daughter were designed to dismantle something she had chosen for herself and replace it with what he had chosen for her. Those things happened, and they caused real damage to real people I love. Knowing the blueprint doesn't fix the building, but I think about it because I think about most things, carefully and at length, and with some attention to what the understanding is actually for. I found out about the end of Landon's career the same way I found out about most things in those days, on a Sunday, over dinner, in a kitchen that was trying very hard to feel ordinary. Landon had told Theo they would play cards after the meal, and Theo had been orbiting that promise all evening in the slightly frantic way of a 7-year-old who has been told something good is coming and cannot quite believe it will arrive without his active supervision. The table had been set with the good cloth, cloth. Yasmin had made something with roasted vegetables that Theo had negotiated himself into tolerating one bite of. The whole scene had the quality of effort, of people who are working to hold a shape. Landon told me after Theo had gone upstairs. He said it quietly, in the tone of a man who has rehearsed the words enough times that they have stopped feeling like his. He said the firm had notified him of a restructuring. He used that word, restructuring, clean and corporate and completely evacuated of the human content underneath it. He said there had been no formal complaint, no performance conversation, nothing in writing that pointed anywhere. He said a colleague he trusted had told him privately that someone had called the firm's senior director and raised questions about Landon's fit with the client relationships at the firm's higher levels. The someone had not given a company name. He said maybe it was just timing. He said maybe he had missed something. He said it the second time with a slightly different emphasis, the way a person repeats a sentence when they are actually asking you to agree with them rather than asking you to answer. I did not agree with him. I did not contradict him either. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when he was done, I told him to get some rest and that we would talk in the week. I meant it. I drove home along my usual road, through the tree line and up toward the ridge, and I kept the radio off. I do my best thinking in silence, and I had a great deal of thinking to do. I was not angry on that drive. I was something else. The closest word I have is calibrated. I was taking in information and setting it against other information and letting the picture finish assembling itself before I decided what it meant. This is something I learned early in my career and have never unlearned. The man who reacts to a partial picture is the man who can be managed. I had no interest in being managed. What I was thinking about specifically was a Monday morning 31 years ago when I signed the first lease on the first office of Rockwell Technical Solutions. It was 400 square feet on the second floor of a brick building on the outskirts of Asheville, with a window that faced west and a water stain on the ceiling in the shape of something I never quite identified. I had 2 employees. We had one second-hand copier that jammed on anything heavier than 20-pound bond paper, and a client list that fit on a single sheet of paper with room to spare, and I had the specific, unreasonable certainty of a person who has decided that the thing they are building is going to last, without any concrete evidence to support that position. I want to tell you what Rockwell Technical Solutions actually does, because it matters to what happened, and because most people, in my experience, have a vague and not entirely accurate picture of it. We do infrastructure certification, structural and systems review, the technical assessment that sits between a development's regulatory submission and its right to break ground. It is not glamorous work, and it is not work that gets discussed at dinner parties. What it is foundational. Before a building of meaningful scale goes up in this region, before the financing closes and the site clears and the contractors mobilize, a qualified engineering firm has to review the infrastructure plan, assess the technical compliance, and sign the approval. That approval is not symbolic. Without it, the project does not proceed. It is that simple and that significant and that quiet. Over 31 years, Rockwell Technical Solutions grew from 2 people in a 400 square foot office to 47 people in a building I own outright, on the outskirts of the same city, behind the same row of Bradford pear trees that have grown considerably wider than the space available to them. We became, somewhere in the middle years, one of 2 firms in this region carrying the regulatory certification required to approve commercial and residential developments above $40 million. The other firm is in Charlotte and has a 3-month average turnaround on new submissions. My name is not on the sign above the door. It never has been. I chose the company name before I chose the office, and I chose it deliberately and without sentiment. Rockwell Technical Solutions is a name that says exactly what the company does and nothing else. There is no face attached to it. There is no story attached to it. It is the name on a door that people knock on when they need something specific done. And over 31 years, the door has been worth knocking on, and that has been enough. I have, in my professional life, met perhaps 4 or 5 people who knew that I founded and owned the company before I told them. The rest encountered it the same way you encounter the structural engineer who signed off on the building you're standing in. You know the work exists. You depend on it existing, and the person behind it simply never occurs to you. Gerald Ashford had submitted his application to Rockwell Technical Solutions 11 months before the Sunday. My son sat at his kitchen table and told me in a carefully neutral voice that his career had just been quietly ended. I did not know this until I went back to the office on a Monday morning. The application had been submitted through the firm's standard intake process, logged and assigned and entered into the queue the way every application is. I had been aware in a general way that we had an Ashford development submission in the system. I am aware in a general way of all active submissions, but I had not looked at it closely, and I had not connected the Ashford on the paperwork to the Gerald Ashford who had been sitting across dinner tables from me for 3 years because there had been no reason to. Gerald and I did not discuss his professional life. He had not offered, and I had not asked. That is something else that happens when a man has already decided what you are. He does not ask what you know. I asked my operations manager, Carol, to pull the complete Ashford development file that Monday morning. Carol has been with the company for 16 years. She is precise and perceptive and completely unflappable, and she had the file on my conference table in 15 minutes without asking a single unnecessary question. She asked one question, whether there was a specific concern with the submission. I told her I wanted to review it thoroughly thoroughly. She accepted this and left me alone with it. I closed the conference room door and sat down with the file. It ran to 112 pages. The project was a 14-floor mixed-use development on the north end of the city, commercial on the lower floors, residential above, with a street-level retail component and a structured parking element that represented the most technically complex part of the submission. Gerald had been assembling this project for 4 years. The financing structure was sophisticated and the investment partners were serious. The regulatory path had been navigated carefully and competently, which suggested Gerald had good technical counsel, even if he did not always take good counsel in other areas. The submission itself was thorough. The technical documentation was organized and complete. The project had cleared every prior hurdle. One requirement remained: a certified infrastructure review and formal approval from a qualified engineering firm with the applicable regional certification. I read through the complete file at the pace the material required. I did not scan. I did not jump ahead. When I finished the last page, I set it down and sat for a moment looking at the surface of the conference table, which is a thing I do when I am processing rather than deciding. There is a difference between those two activities, and knowing which one you are doing is, in my experience, one of the more useful skills a person can develop. Then I stood up, walked to the window at the far end of the room, and looked out at the parking lot for approximately 2 minutes. The Bradford pear trees were coming into blossom. They do that earlier than most people expect. They are a tree that has committed to appearing ahead of schedule regardless of the conditions, which I have always found either admirable or cautionary depending on my mood. I walked back to my desk and called Carol in. I told her to place the Ashford Development Group submission application reference CTF 2847 into comprehensive technical review. I told her to issue the standard extended review notification citing the applicable regulatory clause and indicating a 60-day process timeline. I told her to ensure the language was standard, nothing unusual, nothing flagged, nothing that would read as anything other than routine procedural process. She asked again whether there was a specific technical concern that prompted the review. I told her I simply wanted it reviewed thoroughly. She said she would have the notification drafted and out by end of business. The letter went out at 4:17 that afternoon. I was already in my car. I want to be precise about what that letter was and what it was not, because the distinction matters. It was not a denial. It was not a delay based on fabricated technical concerns. It was not a punishment dressed up as procedure. What it was an exercise of discretion, the kind of discretion that a firm in our position is explicitly authorized to exercise when a project of this scale and complexity warrants additional review time. The regulatory clause was real. The 60-day timeline was within the permitted range. The language was identical to language we had used on other submissions in other years for other reasons. If Gerald Ashford's project had come to us from anyone else, in any other context, I might still have placed it into extended review simply because a project of that complexity deserved it. I have thought about this carefully. I continue to believe it. I drove home that evening along the familiar road, through the tree line and up toward the ridge, and I made dinner and sat at my desk and looked out at the dark yard beyond the window, and I slept without difficulty. I have always taken that as a reliable indicator that I have done the right thing. When I am not at peace with a decision, sleep makes itself scarce. That night, it did not. Gerald's investment partners began calling him before 9 the following morning. This is not something I orchestrated or observed directly. It is simply the logic of how money moves when a project at final stage encounters an unexpected delay. A 60-day extension in those circumstances does not stay contained. It propagates through every financial relationship attached to the project the way a change in pressure propagates through a pipe system, immediately, completely, and in every direction simultaneously. The lenders call, the equity partners call. The contractors who have been holding schedules open begin asking questions. Within a few hours, what had been a single administrative letter becomes a set of conversations that Gerald Ashford was not prepared to have. He held those conversations. I have no direct knowledge of their content. What I know is that by midday of the day after the letter went out, Gerald Ashford was making inquiries about the status of his submission and the reason for the delay. These inquiries came through the firm's standard channels. They were handled by our project coordination team in the standard way. They received the standard responses. On Wednesday of that week, Gerald called Rockwell Technical Solutions directly. Our receptionist answered, as she always does, with the firm's name and a question about how she could direct the call. Gerald said he was calling regarding the Ashford development submission and needed to speak with someone who could speak to the timeline. She said, of course, and asked him to hold for a moment. She transferred the call to the project contact on record for the Ashford submission. That project contact was Landon. I had offered Landon a position at the firm 2 days earlier. I had asked him to come by the office, told him to dress for a professional environment, and not given him any more information than that. He had arrived on a Monday morning and stood in the lobby of a building he had never had reason to visit and looked up at the production floor the way people look up at things that are larger than they expected, with his head slightly back and his mouth slightly open and an expression that was working to catch up with what his eyes were taking in. 47 people, 40 feet of ceiling crossed with cable lines and rolled technical drawings, a floor that had been running well for a long time and moved with the particular rhythm that a well-run operation develops, not hurried, not performative, simply purposeful. principal. He had shaken hands with a member of the technical division who had introduced himself and said, without any prompting from me, that Landon looked just like his father. Landon had shaken the hand and said thank you, and I had watched from across the floor as something shifted in his face, not understanding exactly, but the beginning of understanding, which is a different and in some ways more interesting thing to watch. I brought him upstairs and set 3 folders on the desk between us. The first held the company financials. The second held the organizational structure. The third had Ashford Development Group on the tab. He picked up the third one first. He read the first page and set it down slowly. He said that was Yasmin's father's project. I told him it was. He said Gerald had never known this company belonged to me. I told him no, he had not. There was a silence after that, which lasted long enough to carry weight. Then he asked how long. I told him 31 years. He looked around the office. He looked at the photograph on the corner of my desk. Him at 10 years old, standing on a job site in a hard hat 3 sizes too large for his head, grinning at the camera with the specific confidence of a child who has no idea yet what the world is going to ask of him. I had put that photograph on my desk the year I took it, and it had not moved since. He looked at it for a while without speaking. I did not say anything about it. There are things that explain themselves more completely in silence than they ever could in words, and that was one of them. I slid a sealed envelope across the desk. I told him to open it. Inside was a formal offer letter for the position of Director of Project Relations at Rockwell Technical Solutions. The compensation package was attached. The role would make use of exactly the skills that 6 years at Callaway Whitfield had built in him. Client relationships, technical communication, the ability to make people feel understood inside a process that is dense and procedural and not always navigable without a guide. He read it through once and then read it again, the way people read things when they are looking not for content, but for confirmation that the content is real. He said he had never done anything like this before. I told him that a man who shows up completely, every time, without being asked twice, already knows 70% of what the job requires. I told him I would teach him the rest. He picked up the pen from the edge of my desk and signed his name at the bottom of the page. He signed it in the steady, unhurried way of someone who has already made up his mind. I signed the company copy after him and set it aside. He started the following Monday. By Wednesday, his name was on the door of an office 2 floors below mine, on the building's south side, where the morning light comes in early and stays until nearly noon. On Wednesday afternoon, our receptionist transferred Gerald's call to the project contact on record for the Ashford development submission. Landon picked up on the second ring. He answered the way I had taught him to answer, with the firm's name and then his own. Rockwell Technical Solutions, Landon Rockwell speaking. I was not on that call. Landon told me about it afterward, briefly, the way he tells me about things that have landed too large for immediate elaboration. He said Gerald had gone quiet when he heard the name. He said the silence was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a man doing rapid arithmetic and not liking the answer. Landon had waited it out without filling it, which told me he had absorbed more from those Sunday dinners than I had given him credit for. Then Gerald had said he was sorry, and that he thought he might have the wrong number. Landon had said he didn't think so, and asked whether Gerald would like to be transferred to the project timeline team, or whether he could help directly. Gerald said he would call back, and ended the call. I was told he sat at his desk for a long time after hanging up, that he searched the company name, that he pulled the registration documents and read them through, that he found the founding date, 31 years prior, and the listed principles, and in the second line, in the standard formatting of a standard regulatory document, the name Grant R. Rockwell, founder. I was not there to see it, but I have known enough men like Gerald Ashford in my life to know exactly what that moment looked like. I know the quality of the silence that settles over a person when the full architecture of a situation becomes visible for the first time, when every assumption they have carried turns out to have been load-bearing in ways they never examined, and the thing they were standing on reveals itself to have been a floor someone else built, in a building someone else owns, on ground that was never theirs to begin with. I know what it looks like to be standing in a room you thought you controlled and discover that every wall in it belongs to someone who has been, the entire time, sitting quietly in the corner with a glass of tea, not saying anything, simply waiting for you to arrive at the place the truth had always been pointed. Yasmin came to my house that Thursday afternoon. She did not call ahead. She knocked, came in when I opened the door, and sat at my kitchen table without taking off her coat. She looked tired in the particular way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that the exhaustion has moved past the muscles and settled into the bones. She asked me whether her father was going to be all right. The question was honest and careful, and deserved an honest and careful answer. I told her I did not know. I put the kettle on. She talked for a while, and I listened the way I always listen, without interrupting, without filling the silences before they were ready to be filled. She told me about the financial collapse her father had lived through before she was old enough to understand it. She told me about who he had been before it and who he was after. She told me that the control, the management, the careful construction of approved circumstances, she had always known it came from somewhere. She had just never been able to name the place clearly until she was sitting at my kitchen table saying it out loud. I listened to all of it. I slid her tea across the table when she was done. We sat in the quiet for a while, the two of us, which is its own kind of conversation and sometimes the most useful kind. I want to say something about what Yasmin told me, because it belongs to this story, even even though it sits at an angle to the rest of it. Understanding why a person becomes capable of a harmful thing is not the same as forgiving the harm. Those are two separate transactions, and they do not have to happen together, or in sequence, or at all, if the person involved decides they don't. What Yasmin gave me that afternoon was not an argument for absolution. It was a map of the territory. And maps are useful not because they make the terrain easier, but because they make it navigable. I kept that map. I have thought about it often since. Gerald came to the office 2 weeks after the call. He came through the front entrance at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed his composure in the car on the way over. Landon met him in the lobby. I watched from the second floor window. I did not go down. I want to be clear about why I did not go down. It was not avoidance. It was not an exercise of power. It was simply an accurate reading of what the moment required. What had happened between Gerald and my son was not my property. I had created the conditions in which it could happen. The rest of it belonged to them. Landon stood in the center of the lobby with his jacket on and his hands easy at his sides, not braced, not performing, simply present in the way that a person is present when they belong somewhere without needing to prove it. Gerald walked across the lobby toward him, and they shook hands. I could not see either of their faces clearly from where I was standing. I did not need to. They moved to the small conference room off the main corridor. I stayed at the window. Landon told me about that meeting the same way he told me about the phone call, briefly, without elaboration, with the precision of a man who is still deciding how much of a thing he wants to name. He said Gerald had been quiet for the first few minutes. He said Gerald had looked at the photograph on the desk, the one of him at 10 years old in the oversized hard hat, and had held his eyes on it for a long time before he spoke. He said Gerald had told him he had been wrong about his family. The sentence was short, and it had not been prepared in advance. Landon could tell the difference. He said he had listened to it, and had said thank you for saying that, and had meant it, and had not pushed further, and had not rushed to offer anything in return. He had simply received it and let it sit. Then he had slid the contract across the table. Fair terms, standard language, nothing designed to wound. Gerald had read it through without speaking. Then he had picked up the pen and signed. Landon signed after him. The only sound in the room was the pen moving across the paper. Then that sound stopped, and it was over. After Gerald left, Landon went downstairs and out through the side door to the small courtyard behind the building. There is an old wooden chair against the back wall, in the spot where the morning light reaches first. I have been drinking my coffee in that chair for the better part of 15 years. Landon sat down in it. He looked at the uneven pavers and the old oak at the far corner, and the plain sky above the roofline. And then, for the first time in longer than I could measure by counting days, he exhaled. Not a performance, not a statement, simply the breath going out of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. I watched from the window above. I did not go down. There are moments that belong entirely to the person inside them, and that was one of them. My going down would not have added anything. My having made it possible was already everything. I drove home that evening along the familiar road, through the tree line and up toward the ridge. I kept the radio off. I thought about my father, who worked with his hands from the time he was 17 until the year he could not anymore, and who never explained that to anyone and never asked to be recognized for it. I thought about what it means to build something quietly, to build it so that it can stand without your name attached to it, to build it so that when the moment finally comes, when the truth finally arrives at the destination it was always moving toward, the building speaks for itself, and clearly, and without any help from you at all. I thought about Theo. The week before, he had found the old hard hat on the shelf in my hallway, the one from the photograph which I had kept for reasons I never examined, and he had pulled it down and put it on his head and looked up at me from beneath the brim with the grave seriousness of a child who has located a piece of important equipment and intends to use it properly. He had asked me what exactly I built. I told him I built bridges. He thought about this. He asked if they were big. I told him they were big enough for the whole family to stand on. He accepted this and went back to what he was doing, which was a puzzle he had been assembling in sections since Saturday and expected to finish by the following Tuesday. I got home that evening and went to the shelf where he had left the hard hat after he was done with it. I picked it up. I found the small nail near the front door where I sometimes hang my keys and set the hat on it instead. It sat there, slightly crooked, a little too small for the nail, the way things that belong to children always seem slightly out of scale with the world around them. No one was there to see me do it. No one needed to be. There is a particular thing that happens when you have been patient for a very long time. Patient in the real sense, not the passive sense. Patient in the sense of continuing to build while the thing that needs to resolve itself takes its time resolving, and the resolution finally comes. It does not feel the way I think most people expect it to feel. It does not feel like arrival. It does not feel like winning. What it feels like, as nearly as I can describe it, is recognition. The recognition that the thing you spent 31 years building was always going to be worth what it cost. That the early mornings and the quiet decisions and the refusal to perform yourself into spaces you had not yet earned were not patience in the service of a plan. They were patience in the service of a truth. And the truth, once it was done traveling, had arrived precisely where it was always pointed. 31 years of silence was not the absence of words. It was the understanding that when the moment finally came, the truth would not need an introduction.